All right, this is Laura George, speech 3, visual aid speech. These are the members of my audience. 4 sitting here, 5th guy running the camera. And he's going to do a fantastic job for me. Ready? Okay. Good evening. Thanks for coming out to the 3rd speech tonight. You can probably try to guess the topic of my speech from looking at some of the things I have out on the table. But I'd like to introduce it by telling a little anecdote, sharing a little anecdote with you. At a Catholic elementary school, it was lunchtime and all the children were lined up in the cafeteria, holding their trays, getting ready to go through the line and get their food. And as they started going through, they came to a table that had big baskets of apples, red delicious, golden delicious apples, and they looked so good. One of the nuns had made a little sign and she put up there and she said, "Take only one. Remember, God is watching." They each took an apple, moved on down to the line, got their entree, and got to the dessert table. Big platters of cookies and chocolate chip cookies, and there was also a sign right there. This sign one of the students wrote, and he wrote, "Take all you want, because God's watching the apples." So, as you can tell, kids love chocolate chip cookies. Now I want to know, is there anyone in this room who doesn't love a good warm chocolate chip cookie or the smell of fresh baked chocolate chip cookies coming out of the oven? And if you say no, then I will say that you are decidedly un-American. And I'm going to explain that statement and a little bit of the history of how the chocolate chip cookie became America's favorite cookie tonight in this speech. Cookies have different names in every country. In England, they're called biscuits. In Spanish, so in Spain or Mexico or anywhere else where they speak Spanish, they're called a galleta. In German, they're called cakes. Or Christmas cookies are called plaatje. And when you speak Dutch, you call it koekje. So we say cookie, the English say biscuit, the Dutch say koekje. Sounds a little bit more Dutch than English, and why would we say koekje or cookie instead of calling it a biscuit? Because we were, after all, a British colony and we do speak English. Well, there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, original settlers in America were also Dutch. Think about New Amsterdam. You've heard of that. New Amsterdam became New York, so we have a predominant Dutch settlement. Secondly, during the Revolution, we were decidedly against anything British, including the slang in the English language. We wanted our own slang, which is why we don't eat fish and chips or bangers and mash over here either, because we didn't want to be associated with the Brits. Also, the English used the term biscuit to encompass everything. Cookies, little cakes, biscuits, scones, anything you could hold in your hand, they called a biscuit. And when they talked about cookies, they would use a specific name, like a macaroon or a jumbo, whereas the Dutch, the generic name for cookies, was koekje, meant little cake. And that's because when cookies were actually invented, that's how they were invented, because years and years and hundreds of years ago, they used not propane or electric ovens, but they used wood-fueled ovens. They'd have to test the oven temperature to make sure it was the right temperature for baking their cakes. So they would make little cakes, koekje, and put it in to make sure that the oven was the correct temperature. The first printed recipes for cookies were right around the 14th century, which is right at the beginning of the Renaissance, so some 700 years ago. So cookies have been in existence for 700 years. And some of those early recipes, when you look over them, they use a specific leavening agent called hartshorn. And a hart is kind of a deer. So they would take deer antlers, they'd shave them and boil it down. And the byproduct was kind of an ammonia byproduct, which was a leavening agent. So a lot of the early recipes, even up until the 1800s, called for hartshorn or ammonia as a leavening agent. So I don't know about you, but I'm kind of glad that we progressed a little bit in that area, because I don't fancy eating deer antlers in my cookies. So cookies have been around for 700 years. But the chocolate chip cookie is a relatively newcomer to the scene, and it's a distinctly American invention. It's actually been around only since the 1930s. And it was invented by a woman in Massachusetts. And she ran a toll house. And a toll house is like a train station, a way stop for travelers. And she ran this bed and breakfast kind of thing. And she was a chief baker and cleaner. And she was kind of renowned in that county or in that stop for her baked goods. And one day she was making her favorite cookies. It was a chocolate drop cookie called a butter drop dew. And she realized she was out of baking chocolate. So instead, she had a little gift that someone had given her, kind of a new thing. It was called a candy bar. And it was a semi-sweet chocolate candy bar, and created by Nestle. And she chopped it up and she threw it into the mix, and she mixed it up and baked it because she thought that the chocolate would go ahead and melt and turn it into the chocolate drop cookies. But instead, as you all can tell, it kept its shape and just melted a little bit and created a chocolate chip cookie. And they were an instant hit. So she began making them, serving them regularly, and they actually called them Toll House cookies because she ran the Toll House, and that's where travelers would come to get it. And Nestle was so impressed with it that they wanted to then market Toll House chips. So they cut a deal with her where they would put her recipe on the back of the Nestle Toll House bag. And as the rumor goes, in exchange for that, she got a lifetime supply of chocolates. So whatever she needed, they would provide the chocolate for it. It's actually the official cookie of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And several cooking sites and cookbooks that I've referenced say that it's actually the most popular cookie in the whole world, and it sprang from a mistake in Massachusetts in the 1930s. Now, every cookbook that you can find that has desserts in it has a chocolate chip cookie recipe. There are 100 out there, and each of them claims to be the best. There's the original Toll House recipe, Hershey's, another big chocolate name that has a recipe in their book, Neiman Marcus chocolate recipe. I don't know if you ever heard the story about that, but supposedly someone had a delicious cookie at a little cafe. They asked for the recipe for it, and when they got their credit card bill, they'd been charged an exorbitant amount for the recipe for the cookies. So they then put it out on the internet for free so that no one else would have to pay for it. Now, Snopes.com can either confirm or deny that, so you believe it or not if you want. But it's just another one of the hundreds of chocolate chip cookie recipes there are. So I'd like to give you a few tips tonight about making chocolate chip cookies. And if you follow these tips, you can come up with the perfect cookie every time. So one important thing is that most of these recipes, they all have the same basic dough ingredients with the flour, the leavening agent, and the brown sugar and white sugar, which actually makes the unique combination that gives the dough its unique kind of molasses-type flavor. But if you're going to make these cookies, you should be sure to soften the butter, not melt it. And you can't soften butter in a microwave or on a stovetop because it melts. You actually have to take some prep time and let it soften before you make the cookies. Another thing is to sift your flour before you measure it, because unsifted flours are settled, densely packed. You get too much flour into it, it can make a doughy or stiff cookie. You also don't want to overwork the dough because that releases the glutens and it makes the cookie kind of stiff. It also helps to refrigerate the cookie dough for a couple hours before you make it. And one thing that I found for uniform size, they make nice little cookie scoops, so it's one-handed, a scoop and a drop. And if you like giant cookies like Ernest, you can even use an ice cream scoop. Cook the refrigerated dough and scoop it and flop it. Cook it for the minimum amount of baking time and take it out of the oven and just kind of let it cool then on the sheet. So it continues to cook through and gives you a nice, soft, chewy cookie. So using these tips, you can always come out with a perfect, delicious cookie. So I hope that the next time you eat a cookie or you bake a cookie and it happens to be a chocolate chip cookie, you'll remember it's America's favorite cookie and you have a little bit of history about how that came to be. Thank you.